recording this event, so if you're not comfortable with being recorded, please feel free to turn your camera off. Okay, Dr. Filgusang or Dr. Ibach, do you have permissions to share your screen?
Oh.
Yes, I think we do. Yes, I see.
Okay, perfect.
Awesome. And Richard, do you just want to introduce ourselves first?
Sure.
A bit?
Okay.
Sure.
Yeah,
So,
great idea.
I'm Jonathan Fugelsang, and I'm the Associate Chair of Graduate Studies. And so I'm somebody who you contact if you have questions about this program or other programs. I know more about this program than other programs, but if you have questions about how to apply, what the steps are, if you have specific questions at all too, just about grad school in general, I can hopefully be helpful with that as well too. And same as Richard as well, who well.
Yeah. Thank you for having us here today. Thank you for that very thoughtful territorial acknowledgement, and thank you for taking time at I know this is a busy time of year for all of you, and it's great to see that so many of you are here to learn more about graduate programs. And the first thing to say about that is, we'll try to be as quick as we can to present some background information, but it won't address everything you'll want to know, and some things might be very unique to your circumstances and situation. So this is just to give you a broad overview of some things to be aware of about graduate programs. But the thing, as Jonathan said, is to encourage you to kind of reach out to us and others who you might know in the program, maybe a thesis supervisor, graduate students in labs you're working in, and getting as much range of information as you can, because there's this is new to all of you, and there's going to be some stuff that's doesn't make sense, or it's hard to understand, or it's confusing, and don't hesitate. That is normal. That it is confusing, and so it doesn't say something about you. Oh, you uniquely don't have some piece of information. No, it is a new thing, and it's expected that you need some help navigating through it and figuring stuff out. So don't feel like you're on your own. There are resources here, and it's wonderful that the Psychology Society is showing that kind of solidarity to kind of help each other through this, because it's an important thing, and there's potential to get confused. So
and websites can be confusing too.
Yes.
And you often will kind of navigate around I know our website, and I still I find it sometimes hard finding things on our own website sometimes, and
Yeah.
and so don't feel bad or if you're confused about finding things on the website, because sometimes it's easier just to ask somebody, and like Richard and myself can easily point you in the right direction.
Yeah.
So.
And if we don't know, we'll help you find out. It's confusing to us sometimes too. It's like,
it really is, and what we know though is we know the right people to ask.
Right.
So that's kind of the most important part about our job.
Yeah.
All right, I should fire up those slides there, and just so we make sure we leave you lots of time to chat with the graduate students.
And feel free to interrupt us at any time if there's anything confusing, and then if there's anything after this that you want further discussion about, please reach out to me. I'll be happy to meet with you. And so, can you see my slides now? Are they visible?
Yes, they're good. Sorry.
Okay, wonderful. Okay, thank you.
We can see your slides, but just so you know, we can see like your whole screen. It's not in presenter view.
Oh. Right.
Okay. How about now? Does that?
That looks perfect.
Yeah, just
that
the
looks
slides
good. Okay.
looks great.
All right. Good. Okay. So the first thing is the question: what is graduate school? And what we're going to be talking about today is graduate programs, research-based programs in psychology. And one thing to sort of say is, that might be the pathway that does fit your goals. But it may be the case that another kind of graduate program is actually a better fit for your goals. So don't think that there's like this one size fits all, that research-based graduate programs in psychology are the only pathway into certain careers you might want to be seeking out. So, but what we're going to be presenting on today is primarily about research-based graduate programs. And so, and when you're talking about graduate school, the first question is, well, what is it? What is graduate school? And what it is in graduate studies in psychology is about training you to make original contributions to psychological science, and then also training you to be able to share your knowledge of your field with others through teaching, through writing, and through professional presentations. So what you'll be doing in graduate school is learning and practicing research methodologies to make original contributions to your field, to the base of knowledge in psychology. And so why might graduate studies be a good fit for you or a good option for you? Well, one thing I like to think of is, people who graduate school is a good fit for are people who have a really deep-rooted curiosity. You like asking questions, and when you have questions, you're really kind of drawn to find those answers to the questions. Because what you're going to be doing in graduate study is your day-to-day work is going to be about persistently investigating things until you kind of find information to help you progress towards answers to those things. And so that you're going to need that curiosity to kind of drive you and keep you persisting towards finding those answers. So another way of putting that in psychological jargon, it means being high in need for cognition, right? It means you really like challenging ideas, challenging questions, and you're not satisfied with just sort of simple answers. You really want to kind of go deeper into things. So that's, I think, probably when I'm thinking about who's a good fit for graduate studies, it's somebody who has that orientation of a strong curiosity. Okay. And so, as I said, what we're going to be primarily focusing on today are research-based master's and PhD programs in psychology. And it's important to realize, though, that in addition to master's and PhD programs in the various fields of psychology, there's also clinical psychology, which is also fundamentally a research-based training program. But unlike other disciplines of psychology, it also includes training to become a professional practitioner and providing mental health services. So you're doing all of the research training that anybody in any PhD psychology program is getting, but you're also getting kind of training in how to be a clinical practitioner. So it's a lot of work, and you're really kind of wearing kind of both of those hats in your day-to-day training as a graduate student in clinical psychology, of your research hat, but also your clinical practitioner training hat.
Yeah.
And go ahead, Aaron.
Sorry, what I was gonna throw in there as well too is just to keep in mind when applying to the clinical programs as well too, this program or other programs, keeping in mind that the faculty, like that, they really are, research is a central pillar to what the program is.
Mm-hmm.
And so and thinking as well too, like the people that you're applying to, research is their, one of their number one priorities, and that's why these clinical psychologists are in a faculty academic positions, because they research is their passion, and is one of their many passions.
Yeah.
And so making sure that you align that when you're applying, that you keep that in mind, that really you focusing that research passion yourself and
Right.
finding that research fit is absolutely critical,
Yeah.
not just for the other programs as well, but for clinical psychology as well too.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's important to, the reason that there is that big research component is, clinical psychology is evidence-based practice, right? And so you need to, in order to be a practitioner in that field, you really do need to understand, what is evidence-based approaches to treatment and to understanding mental health issues. And also, our clinical faculty sort of also mention how, the orientation of a researcher is actually also aligned with that of clinician or clinical practitioner, because in your clinical practice, you are doing a lot of the same things you're doing in research. You're collecting information from, people who you're meeting with in order to, and then you're testing hypotheses about what might be the source of some problem that they're dealing with. And then you're trying out different treatments, and then you're monitoring the evidence of how it's going for that individual. And so a lot of the sort of way of thinking about, clinical practice is really aligned with the same kinds of approaches that drive research as well. Now, there are, however, applied master's programs. We have a couple here, one in the developmental area and one in the IO area. And those programs are less research focused and more focused on courses and practical skills training. And so you will find some applied master's programs in psychology departments out there at Waterloo and other programs as well. But so, you know, and those are a little bit different, and you're not going to be being trained in those programs to, you know, do original research projects necessarily. Okay. Now, as I said, though, some of you may have interest in getting professional training to work in mental health fields that wouldn't necessarily require the research training of a master's PhD clinical psychology program. So we do want you to be aware that there are other kinds of graduate programs out there that have more of that professional practitioner training focus. So there are some counseling psychology programs, for example. Now, some counseling psychology programs are research focused, but then other counseling psychology programs are more focused on the applied clinical training. So counseling psychology, often they're in education faculties or education schools. So you might have a look at whether that might be a better match to the careers that you're seeking out. There's also social work programs. There's medicine too. So psychiatrists provide mental health services, and that's a very different training program than a master's PhD clinical psychology program. There's psychiatric nursing. There are various psychotherapy master's programs or diploma programs, art therapy, speech and language therapy. There's a real plethora of different kinds of professional training programs that are in the sector of mental health. And so don't feel like, you know, a master's PhD in clinical psychology is the only route into mental health professional work. There are these other options, and these other options might be a better fit with you if research is not as core to your interests. Okay. But as I said, we are here today to mostly talk about the structure and application process for master's and PhD programs in research-based psychology programs. But one thing that you're going to see among those programs are a lot of variety of, you know, the entry into those programs. They're structured in different ways. So some of them are direct entry into PhD. So going right from your bachelor's, applying to a PhD program, whereas others, you first apply to the master's program, then you complete your master's thesis, and then you apply to the PhD program. So some of them are structured that way. And then there are some programs out there that are what are called terminal master's programs, where you apply directly to the master's program, and then there's no expectation of and no pathway to continue to your PhD. Some of those applied master's programs that I was talking about are more like that of a terminal master's program. And the important thing to say here is that sometimes it's arbitrary whether it's like a program is structured to have direct to the PhD versus master's first, then PhD. But you should be aware of what type of program you're applying to, so that you don't kind of apply in a way that may cause confusion, where, you know, they're expecting you to apply to their master's program first and you're applying to their PhD program. So just make sure you have a careful look at the different programs you're applying to make sure you understand that.
Yeah, and what I'd add to what Richard is saying there too is just and this is a kind of, if there's one take-home message I think that Richard and I would want you to have from today is to make sure you communicate with somebody in the program that you're applying to and ask questions and get a sense what the program is like. And so, for example, here you might not from the website, you might not really kind of appreciate or understand how our program works. So, like for example, we have MA programs, of 2 years and PhD of 4 years, and and from the outside, it looks like it might look like, well, that's a terminal master's degree, and then you do the master's, and then it's kind of uncertain what's going to happen during the PhD. And the way our programs work here basically is we kind of treat the MA as it's an MA along the way.
Yeah.
And And so you do the MA along the way to the PhD, and it works out well. So we basically can guarantee here 6 years of funding because of that.
Yeah.
So when you're looking at direct entry programs to PhD, sometimes it might be at a cost of not as many years of funding that you might need or you might want to have.
Yeah.
And really you don't want to kind of think about grad school as a race to get through anyways.
Yeah.
You want to take this time to make sure you get as much research as you can and have the most productive graduate school experience that you can. And so thinking about that and considering that about how much time you might want to have and whether, what that program might offer you and how it basically works are important questions to ask. So reach out to somebody like me or Richard if it's at Waterloo, or if it's another school you're looking at, reach out to our equivalents at those other schools or potential supervisors to kind of get a sense of how their program works.
Yeah, because as Jonathan is saying, those programs that are master's first programs, if you misunderstand, you might frame your application as if like you're intending to stop after your master's.
Exactly,
and they're actually not expecting that. They're expecting you're going to do your master's, then you're going to enter into their PhD program. So you don't want to signal, oh, you're going to be finishing your studies at your master's level, because otherwise they might think, well, you're not a fit for their program.
That's an extremely important point Richard said there, is that I know for us, when we're like people, if you talk to faculty members here, they don't think about our MA program as a terminal master's at all. And if somebody applies and they're just interested in the master's and they want to get their master's, and then with the exception, the MASC programs are different. So that's a little bit different but for the MA programs that have that, then we as faculty members, we as potential supervisors are looking for students that plan to do the PhD. We plan on spending these 5-6 years together, and they're looking for students that have those same goals. So
thank you, Jonathan. That's really important point to emphasize. And we do want to clarify, clear up some other kind of myths that are out there. Like, some people sort of think about graduate studies as just kind of a continuation of the kind of study that you're doing and the kind of experience you're having as an undergraduate. But it's actually very different in a lot of important ways. One important way is that some people think, oh, you're just kind of paying the same way you kind of pay as an undergraduate. And it's true, graduate programs have tuition, but most programs also have some kind of stipend that you're being paid to help cover your tuition costs and also some of your living expenses. And so, it's different that way too. Especially research-based master's and PhD programs usually have some stipend that you're being paid to cover tuition and living expenses. It's also not just, the coursework is very different in graduate studies than in undergraduate studies. It's more likely to be seminar-based. You're taking fewer courses overall as a graduate student because you need time to be focused on doing your research projects and other things. So that's another important way that it's different. It's more experiential learning and actually producing research rather than taking a lot of courses. Another myth is that, you have to have it all worked out before you apply to graduate studies. You have to know what your thesis topic is going to be, your dissertation topic, and so forth. And that's not at all true. You have to have animating interests that are aligned with the program that you're applying to, but it's not at all expected that you already know what you're going to be doing all of your research projects on. That's part of what you're going to be, developing in your graduate studies. A research program that you're then going to work on in collaboration with your mentors and others in that program. And then finally, there's a myth, especially for clinical master's and PhD programs, that you need some kind of clinical experience in order to get into those programs. And that's typically not the case. So those are some things we want to kind of make sure you don't sort of go in with misunderstandings about that. So as we were talking about, though, the application process to graduate studies is new for all of you. And so there's going to be a lot of things for you to kind of research and think about before you begin applying. And one critical thing is finding programs to apply to. And we encourage you to utilize diverse sources of information about programs in order to figure out what are the ones you're going to apply to. You could use lists like Canadian Psychological Association lists different programs, or other professional societies have lists of what are the master's and PhD programs out there. There's also databases and also articles you can use. So you might find blog posts about graduate PhD programs. Again, CPA, Canadian Psychological Association, has lots of blogs and articles about how to find programs and advisors. You could go to the websites themselves of different programs, and that's very encouraged to do. You should thoroughly look at the programs that you're thinking of applying to, look at information about the faculty members in those programs and also the graduate students in those programs. And that'll give you a sense of whether that program really is a good match to what you're trying to do. We very much encourage you to talk to professors here and graduate students here because they know their colleagues at other institutions and they can help you figure out if a program is a good fit to you. Something Jonathan and I always emphasize is that you consider searching outside of Ontario. Don't sort of just focus on only the programs that are close by, because you'll be kind of constraining it yourself and ruling out what might be really good options for yourself. And also consider applying outside of Canada too, because the credentials are transferable across borders. So if you expand, the range of programs that you consider, then you'll have a lot more options.
And just to stress,
yeah.
I think we can't stress that idea of like talking to professors here enough. Especially like, so that's whoever you're doing an honors thesis with, if you're doing an honors thesis, somebody, that's if you're somebody that's in an area that you're interested in the department, it's a small world, academics.
Yeah.
It's surprisingly small in many ways. And we know a lot of people in a lot of different labs in the country and outside of the country. And if you if you're interested in some area, we likely would know, a lab that might be a potential good fit, that we know a potential supervisor who might, kind of fit with what your interests are, and we can help steer you in those directions. So, and I don't just mean like Richard and myself, but it could be whoever, if you have an honors thesis supervisor or somebody who you might just look on the website and see what the research interests are and they align with you. You might be interested in their lab, but you might also be interested in other labs, around the country or North America or elsewhere that they might know something about.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, that's totally right. Talking to people who know the field really well. Don't feel like you're on your own, right? Turn to people here who have knowledge, who can help you. And that question of how to know if a program is a good fit for you or not, I think, the most important ways to determine that are to look at the research, right? Because as we've been emphasizing, what you're going to be doing as a graduate student is getting trained in research and producing research. And so reading the research articles of the faculty in the program, and also I really emphasize looking at the research that's produced by the graduate students in those programs, because that's what you're going to be. You're going to be a graduate student in that program, and you want to sort of see, well, what kind of research are they producing, the graduates in those programs? And if you're sort of reading their papers and you're like, wow, that's really cool, or that excites me, that's a way of knowing, wow, you're going to really thrive in that program.
Yeah, and that's an extremely important point, is really looking at the graduates. You want to find, a lab, looking at labs, you want to see what the graduate students are producing, because that's a good sign of, the degree to which you might find yourself being productive in that lab. So you want to basically see, what are the students doing? Do students, is this a lab where students can be successful? Is this a lab where students can students can kind of carve out their own paths? And you can find out a lot of that by talking to graduate students in potential labs as well too.
Yeah, absolutely. Okay. So, and one question that comes up a lot is, should you get in touch with people before you apply? Should you reach out to potential supervisors? And we do encourage that. It's actually a good strategy to email them in advance, introduce yourself, tell them a little bit about yourself, like what your core interests are, maybe some research experiences that you've had, but also make sure you show them that you really understand them in some way. Like, you don't want to send the same generic email to, different people. You want to sort of have it be customized to that faculty member who you're reaching out to. Tell them a little bit about, some of the research of theirs that you've found particularly resonant with your own interests. And that'll be a way that your email will connect with them, stand out, and they'll remember you when they see your application later on. What not to do is to not, as I said, send the same generic email to everybody. We've sometimes seen like where all the faculty members in a program all received the same contact email from the same applicant, and when they're getting together and talking, they're like, oh yeah, I got that email and it was the same thing, right? And that it takes away from it. Actually, that winds up backfiring, right? Because the purpose of emailing is to establish a connection and build a relationship. And if it's not specific to them, then it's actually gonna not help. So do, before you send an email, think it through, look it over, tailor it to that person. Send it with purpose, not with just some kind of general blast out of information. There are components of your application that are important to think about and start preparing for. To have a successful application, you're going to need some things. So grades do matter. So it's important, throughout your studies to be, trying to maintain, a strong average especially in your field, in your major. But grades aren't everything. So don't feel like, oh, if I'm acing things and I'm, getting 90s in lots of my classes and things like that, that I'm a shoo-in. I'm going to necessarily get into graduate studies. And that's not the case, right? Sometimes somebody with a lower grade might have more research productivity as an undergraduate. They've done an honors thesis and they've been very active in research labs. That's the kind of person that a program is going to be more interested in than somebody who just has a few points higher on their average. So yes, grades matter, but they're not the only thing and not necessarily the most important thing. GRE is the graduate record exam. That's required by many psychology programs, especially before COVID, it was required. Many programs suspended it during COVID, and it's kind of in a wait and see kind of phase where some of them are bringing it back, some aren't. And what the graduate record exams are standardized exams. They include quantitative sections, but also verbal reasoning sections and analytic reasoning sections. And so it's important to find out whether the GRE is a requirement for the programs you're applying to. And if so, prepare for that. There are various study guides that are available to you in our library and in the Center for Career Action. And so it's good to kind of to familiarize yourself with the content of those exams, do some practice exams so that you're prepared to take them if they're something that's required in the programs you're applying to. Again, though, something that I want to say about that is, although the GRE might be a requirement, it's not the only thing, or again, not the most important thing in a graduate application. It's important to do your best, but to not think, oh, just if I get high scores on my GRE and I have a high GPA, that I'm a shoo-in for graduate studies. Because what's going to matter a lot in the application process is having reference letters from faculty members who you've worked with during your undergraduate studies. And these should be letters from people who know you as an individual. So they don't just know the grade that you earned in their class, because if that's all they can say about you, well, that's already there in your transcript. So it's not going to stand out as a letter. What you really want is a letter from somebody who's worked with you in a much more individualized way. Like maybe you've been a research assistant in their lab, maybe they were your honors thesis supervisor, maybe you did a directed studies project with them. Or maybe you were in a small seminar where you did really standout work that was memorable. So you want to kind of make sure that you cultivate good relationships with your faculty members and take advantage of opportunities to have those kind of more experiential learning coursework so that you can then draw on those people as reference letters to attest to your preparedness to go to graduate studies.
And just to add to what Richard's saying there as well too is, yeah, I can't stress the idea that how important reference letters are. And so just two things I wanted to just kind of add to that is kind of reiterating the point that the academic world is a small world,
yeah.
And so reference letters, when we're receiving them, we often will know the people writing the letters.
Yeah.
and so their word means a lot to us. You know, like, so there, it's like our colleagues, friends and colleagues writing letters on behalf of the student, and we look at that and
Yeah.
it's like, and like, and it's like, oh, my colleague, you know, so and so really thinks this student is strong and thinks that they're, you know, that they would make a wonderful graduate student. Well, we're gonna take that really seriously, because this is a colleague, this is a good colleague of ours who's vouching for this student, and we know that this colleague wouldn't vouch for the student to come to our lab unless they really, you know, believed in that student.
Yeah.
And so they really mean a lot. And also, I want to kind of say 1.2 is, don't feel funny asking for reference letters. I think oftentimes students feel like a little like they're putting faculty members out. It's like, oh, they feel kind of a bit guilty asking for reference letters or asking for a bunch of them. This is part of our job, and it's like we get, well, I don't want to say we don't get paid specifically for that. We don't, you know, write down and get a check depending on how many we write. But that is, it is part of our jobs. Like, it's part of our, like, meeting with students, talking with students asking us questions. A faculty position is it's a wonderful position that has lots of different aspects to the job, and it's very, it has, and one of the things is writing reference letters and meeting with students and answering questions for students, having students knock on the door and coming in, and that is absolutely part of our jobs. And so writing letters and saying, that's absolutely something that we do, and that we are happy doing.
Because we want talented people going on in our field, and so we're happy to help you. You know, if you've worked with us and we see, you know, that you have the skills and the ambitions to succeed in graduate studies, we want to help you do that. So yeah, Jonathan's absolutely right. You know, we recognize the importance of reference letters. We know, and it's for us a gesture of gratitude too for the work that you've done in our labs or in other ways to you know, help our research programs and projects. So
honestly, it's something that I think excites us the most. Is when we well, the two things that excite us the most, when strong students join our labs, and also when we send strong students to other labs and they get into graduate school. It's something that's really, it's awesome for us, and we are extremely happy, excited about that. So it's something that gets.
We consider that. Yeah, please.
So sorry to quickly cut in. We have a question from a student asking a clarification question about if the professors need to be from the faculty that you're applying to. For example, asking a sociology professor to write a reference letter for you, even if you're applying to a psychology graduate program.
That's an excellent question, and they could be from other programs. They do usually need to be an academic reference letter from somebody who has a permanent position in a faculty program, but they don't have to be from the program you're applying to. So it very much could be a sociology faculty member writing a letter for a student who's applying to a psychology graduate program.
And we often see those.
Absolutely.
And just and also to stress the part that Richard said, it is. It's not a kind of hard rule about, you know, them being a, you know, a faculty in a department, but it's highly recommended. It's something, you know, like if you can, like, I would, you know, kind of try to prioritize and have reference letters being, you know, being faculty members, you know, that are you know, permanent faculty members in departments.
And for that reason, you do want to like I said, take advantage of opportunities to do experiential courses, and especially honors thesis is a really important opportunity to take advantage of as an undergrad, because there's probably no courses that you'll do and no experiences that you'll do as an undergrad that will better help you assess your preparedness for graduate studies and help demonstrate it to programs than having done an undergraduate honors thesis. And so, and the reason I'm mentioning it now is because your thesis supervisor is going to be one of the most important letters because they're going to know your research training and preparedness for graduate studies better than anybody else who you've worked with usually. Okay. Sorry that I'm going quick. I do want to kind of get through things because I know we want to give you as much time for the panels with the graduate students and your Q&A as well. So let me try and kind of get through a few other things here, and then we'll wrap things up. Another thing that's very important part of your application is your statement of interests. Most programs ask you to submit some statement about you. And what they're looking for, though, is a statement of what your core research interests are, and especially how you see those aligning with their program. So sometimes when students do these statements, they think it's about them in a more general sense, like they feel a need to kind of tell about how they discovered psychology and this kind of interesting stories, and they're very interesting sometimes about their background and how they came to psychology. But sometimes, although that might be interesting to read, it's not telling the program what they need to know, which is what your research interests are and how they fit that program. So make sure that's the focus of what you're writing about, rather than other stuff about you. So make sure that's something you emphasize early in the letter, what your research interests are. Explain, why those topics interest you, and make sure that you connect them to the faculty members there. Show them how your interests align with faculty members, and usually more than one faculty member in that program. Make it clear that you understand their program, understand what are key themes in the research projects there, so that they can see that fit, because that's basically what they're trying to do. They're trying to sort of imagine you in their program and imagine you succeeding in their program. And so your statement of interest is the most important vehicle for helping them to create that imaginative leap to see you in their program.
And as Richard said here, and I know we're pushing time here, but I just did really one thing, and to as Richard noted too, is mentioning a couple people in the letter is good.
Yeah.
And also it's like Waterloo is what we co-supervise a ton, and other programs too as well co-supervise a ton, where oftentimes like a student will come in and they'll be working with a couple faculty members. Yeah. And it seems to be more and more common, it seems like not only in Waterloo but in other institutions as well too. So that's why it's important, if you can, to kind of make connections to a couple people in your letter.
Yeah, because if it's only one, well, maybe that person isn't taking students that year, or maybe their lab's already full or something like that. And as Jonathan's saying, like, they're trying to sort of see, you contributing to the program culture, not just like one lab's culture usually. And so when I was saying before, when I said, you don't want to send the same generic email to all of the members of a program, that doesn't mean you shouldn't email, more than one member of that program. It's just that it should be tailored to each of those individuals, telling Professor Fugelsang why you connect with his interests, but also telling Dr. Kohler why you connect with his particular interests.
Saying, and basically saying, you could say I'm reaching out to so-and-so as well too.
That's
like,
right.
With when you're emailing, I say I'm also reaching out to so-and-so in the department. Right. And then chances are then what'll happen is we'll walk down the hall, or COVID time, cold call our colleague on Teams and say, hey, we got this this application looks really strong. What do you think? And oftentimes if you connect with two people, I think the odds are going to be even stronger. I think that you're going to find a fit, because you have two excited people that can see you potentially joining the lab. And that's and sometimes, like, if one person is thinking, oh, I'm pretty full, my lab is full, but but then, well, if there's another colleague who's co-supervising as well too, and it's like, well, okay, and maybe like you're more likely to I think to find that fit that way.
Yeah, and often graduate students can be that kind of synergy that helps connect faculty members who've wanted to work together
for sure, all
their career, and they just haven't found that opportunity yet. And you can be that connection that helps them to kind of start that happening. Okay, I'm going to skip through interviewing because that's more down the road after you kind of, if you've it does come, it's a part of the process though, but it takes different forms. Sometimes you might be interviewing before they make a decision to admit you. Sometimes you might be interviewing afterwards. So there's a lot of variety in what role, if any, interviewing plays in the admission process and decision. So we can talk about that another time, but I know we're running out of time, and I think it's too there's too many different versions of what interviewing means to kind of cover that in a short description. So the last thing that I want to say is, and Jonathan, if there's you can join in here too if there's any wrap up things you want to say, of course. But the important thing for you to do is, given all that we've been talking about, you want to be sort of thinking about how you're going to be able to stand out as an undergraduate, so that you're going to get those very strong reference letters, and you're going to be able to write a statement of interest that sounds really that has depth to it and interest to it. And so the way to do that is to start thinking as early as you can as an undergraduate about your work and the work that you're doing in the program. So be a visible member of your program. Be that person who comes to the office hours to ask follow-up questions, or who stays after class to sort of get a clarification about something, or raises their hand when the instructor asks questions. That will stand out. We remember those students when they kind of come back later and ask us to do a thesis project with them or something like that. Show a willingness to work hard, when they're, and not just to work hard, but to also to take on challenging things, to show that you want to learn, you want to grow. So, if you're working in a lab and there's a new kind of coding system that's being developed, and the graduate student who's running that sort of saying, does anyone want to help out with this, or does somebody want to learn this? Be that person who sort of takes that leap and tries that out. Show an interest in research by doing research apprenticeships or volunteering in research labs, certainly by doing an honors thesis. Develop relationships with your mentors. As with anything, as with any kind of system, relationships matter an awful lot. And so you want to start making those relationships here as an undergrad, in the labs that you're working in, or in the seminars that you're taking, because that will show that you're able to develop successful relationships in the graduate programs that you're applying to. And show responsibility and reliability. If you make commitments, follow through on those. And as I said, take on challenging tasks. Don't be afraid to grow and learn. If you show that, even though we expect, growth, it takes time, and it's not always, when you're trying something out for the first time, you're not going to necessarily do it optimally at the beginning, but show that you're willing to persist and keep trying, and take on new things and learn. That's the kind of thing that allows us, and that often makes a really great letter, where you sort of show somebody who's, like you say, at first they seemed really timid, but then they started to ask questions, and then I saw them really taking off and really flourishing. That kind of narrative of seeing growth can really be quite powerful. So stick with it, and start early too, right? Because the growth and development is a process, and so waiting until the last minute to start getting involved in research is going to sort of set you back. So start that process early. Seek out advice, so that we can kind of help you plan out what you're going to do to make yourself a successful applicant to grad programs. Okay, I'll wrap up there, and I will stop sharing my screen so that we can see if you have any clarification questions. And Jonathan, was there anything you wanted to say?
I thought that was perfectly said there, Richard. And okay. and the only thing I'd add is just to kind of remind and reiterate: don't feel like shy about asking for help about anything along the way. Like even your application packages, you can ask your honors thesis supervisor to take a look at it, and it's part of our jobs to do that and to look over and give feedback. And just to kind of and stress too as well too, think about applying for Tri-Council and OGS scholarships. It's not only because they're wonderful to get, which they are, but also because they signal to your potential people that you're applying to that you understand the system, that you're passionate about science, that you're a go-getter, that you're thinking about these things, you look them up, and that you're kind of you're doing all the right things. and ask your supervisors or your other, somebody else to look over your scholarship applications as well too, like your research proposal. That's a hard thing to write as an undergraduate student when you don't even know where you might end up being. How do you write a research proposal? And ask your supervisor to help you out with that too. Like that's what we do. And it's you're not putting us out at all by asking us to help you with those things. That's part of our jobs.
Yeah, thank you for that reminder, Jonathan, because I did have a slide about scholarships. That's something to start thinking about, because that comes later in the term, like after usually around the time you're applying for your graduate programs. And it's good to do that. You don't usually need to have a secured a scholarship to get into grad programs, but it's good to have applied for them, because programs will know that you've applied, and that might help them to sort of
it puts you on other multiple radars. Like, and that's and especially, I think this is especially true for the clinical programs where you might be like, sorry to say, one of 200 or so applicants to a specific program. Like that's around the numbers that we get here. And it's like, okay, so you're in the application pool and you want to stand out in this group of 200. Well, then you pop up in the Tri-Council SHRC or CHR or NSERC scholarship list as well too. It's like, oh, this student, there's that student's name again, there's and it's like, oh, their students is in the, it kind of, it signals and it shows, it helps you stand out.
It shows the seriousness.
It shows the passion. It shows the, taking the initiative to do things. And that's really what you want to signal as a prospective, I never get that right, prospective, and potential graduate student.
Awesome. So thank you to Dr. Fuglesang and Dr. Eibach for that presentation. It was very, very informative and definitely helped answer questions I know that we all had. Graduate school can be very intimidating and confusing, so thank you again. As we move on to the panel, I'd like to ask students to send in their questions through the chat just so that we can keep track of it and make sure that all of your questions do get answered. Additionally, if our graduate students would like to introduce themselves as well, that would be amazing. Also, John and Richard, you're more than welcome to stay for this as well. I know you guys' input is always valued.
Okay. You know what, though? I think we probably will step off just to kind of give you guys
of course,
space
absolutely.
to kind of...
That makes sense.
Before, and and what we were thinking, Jerica, is we didn't want to hover, and and if we had any sort of,
absolutely, that totally makes sense.
Wanted to kind of make sure that there's no, so we thought maybe we'd step out and let the students talk with the graduate students.
Sure.
And if that's okay with you, Jared, that's what
no, absolutely, that's totally okay.
Please reach out to us if you have questions. Meet with us. We're happy to help.
Amazing. Thank you guys again.
Thank you for having us.
See you.
Enjoy the rest of your evening.
Bye.
Bye.
Okay, so sorry, I think I can hear myself echoing. Okay, so if we could move on to introductions, that would be amazing. And then we can get started on some of the questions that have already appeared in chat.
Oh, sorry, you go, Alex.
Sorry, I'm Alex. I'm a first-year master's student from Nova Scotia in the cognitive psychology program. And I'm interested broadly in decision-making and how we can help people make more accurate or more pro-social decisions in their daily life.
Awesome. I'm Maya, and I'm also from Nova Scotia. I'm in my first year of the MASC program in developmental and communication science here. And I say first year because the MASC is 1 year, but I'm actually doing something a little bit unique, and I'm extending the MASC into an MA so I can do a little bit more research and get a bigger project. I'm working in the social development lab, so it's in the developmental area, working with Dr. Heather Henderson. And I'm really interested in how children interact with their social environments and how temperamental traits like how shy or how sociable they are influence these social interactions.
I'll go first then, and I'll toss it to you after, Serena. So my name is Janessa. I'm in my second year of my master's in the clinical area. And my research interests there are a lot of seem like different concepts, but I'm tying them all together in my work. So I look at body image, eating disorders, self-compassion, and also emotional distress and tolerance, which is somebody's ability to be able to tolerate distressing emotions. And I'm from a very small town called Amherstburg, which is near like the Windsor-Detroit border.
Hi, I'm Serena. I'm in the first year of my PhD in clinical psychology, and I'm interested in the role of emotional processing in cognitive behavioral therapy.
Okay, amazing. So, as our first question, this kind of appeared during the presentation, but a student asks, if you did not want to do a thesis, would a self-directed study be okay for graduate school?
So I can jump in. I think it depends on what grad school you're applying to. So if you look on the websites, some programs will have both a research-based and a paper-based option for their master's. So it really just depends on the school that you're applying to and the program that you're applying to, whether or not that would be an option.
Yeah, I just want to say I recently applied to quite a few graduate programs. And like Janessa said, it really does depend on the program. Some require that you do an honors thesis, but some don't. But I would encourage that you do get some research experience, even if it is a self-directed project. It's great to have, and it's good to know what research is like before applying to a research-based program.
I realize now in Maya's answer that I did not answer the right question. I'm so sorry. I thought you meant like in your like at a master's level, if you had to do like a experimental like research project, or if you could do a paper. But yeah, no, I think a lot of schools do appreciate the master's thesis, and it can be really helpful to have that. But I do know individuals that have been accepted into grad school that have research experience other than their master's. I think the biggest thing to think about is what parts of the research process you have experience with. So, and that's something that came up in a lot of my interviews was like, is there any areas of the research project you don't have, or research process you don't have experience with? So you want experience with like doing lit reviews, doing data analysis, like kind of what are the implications of things? If you can get experience like at conferences in any capacity, that's fantastic, but that doesn't all have to be on the same project. So it's possible to get really great research experience at all stages of the research process, but involved in different processes as like a research assistant or something too. So more about the experiences than necessarily how you're getting them.
Awesome, thank you for those. Oh, we have a raised hand. I'm not sure if it's in relation to the current question.
Hi, no, it was not. I'm just putting myself in line because I can't find the chat button. Sorry.
Oh, yeah, absolutely. I think we have 3 questions ahead of you, but I will call on you once those are answered, if that's okay.
Yeah, of course. I'm sorry. Obviously,
no worries. No, it's okay. All good. So our second question is around the differences between research-based and professional psychology programs in terms of what might be required to apply and the differences between the requirements. Does that make sense? Let me just read out the question.
Are you referring to a PsyD versus a PhD? Is that it?
I'm unsure. So the question asks,
I think PsyD would be the like professional program, like
Okay.
at least when it comes to clinical. Like
Okay.
there's PhD and PsyD, so maybe if you wanted to talk about that.
Okay. I can speak to that a tiny bit. To my understanding is that a PsyD, the idea behind that is you get the clinical training without the research component. It's a very, very different type of training. You are not getting as much training as a science practitioner. It's more purely research. I know I wish I could say much more than that, but I can't say that much more. I think that there are different also privileges as well. I don't think you can you can't diagnose as well. So there's some differences in the types of work and the types of training. I also don't believe that there's assessment training. That's a big thing that people don't always No, but clinical is that you do a lot of training in psychological assessment. And so that is the process of ruling out different diagnoses in order to arrive at a formulation for what kind of symptoms a client has. And that's something that is very much unique to clinical psychologists. It's not really something that other mental health professions do, although therapy is something that you can do with a lot of different mental health professions. I'm rambling, but yes, I wish I knew more. I can't answer your question very well, but that is what I can say.
Yeah, I think Serena said all that I know as well about like PsyD versus PhD when it comes to clinical psych. I don't know if somebody else knows more, but generally I know like there's not as heavy of a research component. I think a couple programs I looked at had you do like a paper instead of doing like a research project, and it more emphasizes clinical skills. But there are some differences in terms of what you're able to do when you finish the program. So I think if that's something that you're considering, really just looking at like what are your goals, what do you want to be able to do at the end of the day, and making sure that the program that you're choosing, whether it be PsyD, PhD in clinical psych, or one of the other professions like a psychotherapist or a clinical social worker, like that is going to meet your needs to be able to achieve those goals.
One other thing that might be interesting about PsyD versus clinical programs is that the structure of the program is very different. I know that with PsyDs, the expectation is that you were working a regular job 9 to 5 during the week and you do your training and your work on the weekend. So it's completely different than graduate school.
Yeah, I can speak a little bit because I'm in the MASC program, so it is more of an applied base than most research programs. So I applied to some strictly research-based developmental psychology programs, and then also this one. What drew my attention to this one was that you do get that applied component, doing a placement somewhere that you, in an area that you like. So I know some people in my year right now are doing some of their placements in libraries. I'm doing mine at a not-for-profit school for children with autism. In terms of what you need for experience when applying, I would say research experience is definitely important for both programs. I think volunteer experience, work experience would be important for both as well. I don't know, again, I don't know how they look at the work experience and volunteer experience in either of the programs, but I would say more so for the applied programs, they're looking that you have experience working in certain domains. For me, like with children, making sure that I have experience working with them hands-on as opposed to a more research-based program. I'm not positive of that, but that's my theory.
Awesome. Thank you guys for those answers to the question. Our next question asks if a reference letter from a PhD student would be good to add to your application package if you were a research assistant under them.
I think this is pretty quick to answer. Ask the professor for a reference letter and tell them that you've worked with this graduate student. They will have the grad student write it for them, and they will sign off on it. You wouldn't want a PhD student signing off on the letter, at least for graduate programs that are research-based.
Okay, perfect. I think Sydney might have been next.
I do have a question, thank you. So I was just wondering if any of you guys had preemptively applied to like SSHRC or NSERC funding, like before you got accepted to any programs, and if so, can you detail how you structured your proposal not knowing what your project was going to be?
So I can jump in here. So I think one thing to keep in mind when it comes to the graduate scholarship, so there's CGS, which is like the NSERC, SSHRC type of thing. There's also OGS. So CGS is federal level scholarships, OGS is provincial level scholarships. If you're applying somewhere in Ontario, if you're applying someplace in a different province, they have a lot of provincial level scholarships as well that you could be applying for. And the proposal is very important. but you don't have to do that research study that you put in the proposal. The purpose of the proposal is more so to showcase that you are able to talk about research, you're able to formulate research questions, you're able to come up with a solid design for a study, but you don't have to actually do that study. So just, you can come up with something that's interesting that you can design a solid study for, have somebody like a faculty member help you with that. If you've got an undergraduate thesis supervisor, they can be fantastic for helping with that. And if you don't end up doing that project, that's completely fine. People get funding all the time. It's a scholarship, and that the proposal is showing your ability to talk about research. They're not funding that research project.
There's also no way that they can check whether you've actually done the study. When I applied and ended up getting funding, it was for a completely different topic that I ended up doing research on. Although this is only true for when you're applying for master's funding before you've started your degree. When you're applying for funding later in your master's degree or in your PhD, you do want to be referencing prior research that you've done in the same field, so it will be a bit different.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's a good distinction. Thanks for making that, Serena. So the process for applying in grad school is different, but you'll have supervisors to help you with that, for sure. But so I guess when you're doing your applications, it doesn't matter what school you're going to end up in. As long as it's a topic that you can write about, you're good.
Awesome, thank you. Our next question asks, when looking for an undergraduate thesis supervisor, oh, so sorry, I just lost it. How can we prepare for the initial meeting with them? Are there any tips you might have on what the conversation would look like?
And I can jump in again. I feel like I jump in faster than other people. Please feel free to jump in before me if you want to take on a question. I think one of the big things is it's very similar to a clinical supervisor, or sorry, a supervisor at a graduate level, not the same degree, of course, in terms of like competition and stuff. But you really want to show like what you know about them, why you think they're a good fit, how your research interests align with theirs. So if you can do like very similar things to how you would prepare for applying for grad school, you want to look and see what kind of research is being done in the lab, read their papers, see what types of research they typically do. Do they do a lot of correlational work? Do they do a lot of experimental work? Do they, like, what types of methods do they do? Are those the types of methods that you want? There's some profs that do a lot of like growth modeling. And if you have no interest in doing that, that might not be a good supervisor for you. So really look at like, what are the methods that they're doing? What are their research interests, and make sure they're a good fit, and then come forth being able to communicate that to them. I really like the fact that you do these methods. I'm interested in doing that. I really like this paper that you wrote. I found that really interesting. So you want to go in there to basically show that you know them and how you align well with them, and have a couple ideas of what you would want to do for your thesis, but you don't have to have it hammered out yet. You just have to have a general idea that aligns well with their work.
Yeah, there's a lot of variation. Some professors will have small projects that they carve out for honors thesis students, and they will give it to you. Some professors will give you some freedom. They might have a data set and give it to you and say, here, you can come up with questions that you're interested in answering. And one other thing that's worth noting is that most of your work in an honors thesis is going to be with a graduate student, and typically not the professor. But yes,
yeah,
no, go ahead.
Yeah, sorry. I just want to say it's really important. A lot of students want to do honors theses, so it's important. I'm not saying that you can't do an honors thesis, but it's you're more likely to get the position that you want if you do some volunteer work in their lab beforehand. Do you all agree? Yeah. Yeah. So if you can, try to maybe get in a volunteer position in your second or third year. And then work your way up to the thesis.
And if you do, say you're doing research in one lab and you realize like that's not really a good fit for you, like that experience is still valuable, but try to get some volunteer RA experience before doing your undergraduate thesis. You don't want that to be your first time doing research, because it'll be hard. It'll be hard for you to do your thesis if you have no exposure to research. It'll be hard to find a supervisor that will take you on if you have no exposure to research.
I'll just add on to that too. It's always a great idea if you're interested in doing honors thesis, but you're kind of on the fence about it. Richard had brought up the idea of directed studies, where you can do a project with a professor that you mutually agree on, but it's not a full-fledged thesis. That's actually really great practice for going into an honors thesis without having to fully commit to it if you're not ready yet, or if you want to get some great research experience. And I'll say too, and I think Janessa touched on this, it can be helpful if you have some sort of personal connection to the professor you're reaching out to do your thesis. So maybe it's a professor you took a class with and you found out they had really interesting research that you're interested in. Or some sort of personal connection helps, because sometimes these professors are getting 30 or 40 emails from students who are interested in doing an honors thesis with them, and they just don't have the capacity to supervise that many students. So if there's some sort of connection you can make, or if you can really do your research into understanding what that professor's interests are and how they align with you, then that's going to really help you stand out when you're making that first initial point of contact with them.
That's a really good point. I want to also just draw on something Alexandra said that's slightly off topic. If you in my experience, when I was an undergrad, I tried to do a lot of independent research projects. I did an honors thesis as well, and that was single-handedly the best experience I had. And that was the most valuable for helping me figure out, do I want to spend 6 to 7 years in graduate school? Because what you are doing as a graduate student is essentially an independent research project. And if you find very quickly this is not for me, then that's really important information. At the same time, keep in mind, graduate research is so complex and so nuanced and so challenging that your first few experiences might be there's a lot of complexity and a lot of challenge to it. So I don't mean if you don't like it in the first 5 minutes, if the research isn't for you, but I mean if this is something, if you can see yourself being compelled by answering interesting research questions, and if you enjoy that process itself, then that's really important information. And I think it's important to not make career decisions in a vacuum, and those type of experiences map very well onto what you do as a PhD student or a master's student. So
Great answers, thank you. On to the next question. A student asks, are any of you able to mention what the ratio for the clinical practice and research aspect is during a MA/PhD in clinical psychology?
I'm laughing because, as Janessa probably has figured out by now, it changes every year. It changes every semester, depending on what your workload is. Some semesters you do a lot of TAing, some semesters it's a lot of research, and it also depends on what stage of the program you're at. But I can say typically throughout the program, you're doing 1 or 2 courses a semester. They're heavy courses because most of your courses have clinical components with it. So for example, you get a course on family therapy where you're doing coursework, but you're also working with a family, or a course on a certain school of therapy and you're practicing it with your clients on the side. In the master's program here, you do 2 assessment clients in your master's degree, and that's yes. And then, but in your PhD, most of the time you are seeing 3 clients at a given time. And so that's about a couple hours per week each, and there's a lot of admin attached to it. You get supervision for each client. So research is something that fluctuates because it's a longer term goal, and it also depends very much on your supervisors. Some supervisors have very strict, have very clear cut goals and deadlines for the students. Some are very relaxed and don't have strict timelines. So it depends a lot on who you're working with, but generally, they front load you with courses. You spend more time on courses early in your master's, and then after that it's very balanced. And I would say clinical work takes a little bit more. I would say it's more research and clinical work, and then classes and TAing are kind of after that.
I think that was a very great response that Serena had, and really it does change a lot. Her point about faculty raised a good point, I think, to keep in mind in terms of the different styles of the supervisors. This probably is very relevant for other programs as well, but particularly with clinical psych, find out what the expectations are for research, because some supervisors, they want you to do your master's and your PhD, and that's good enough for them. And other those 2 projects, or however many projects compose that research program that you have. Whereas other people, there's an expectation that in addition to your own master's and PhD work, that you will do side projects, that you'll help out with larger research projects. And so you really keep in mind how much you want research to be taking up your time, and making sure that that supervisor is a good fit in that capacity. Serena also answered the question really well for the University of Waterloo, but that is something that's going to be different depending on the clinical program you're in, and something you should consider in applying. I know that there's some programs where they don't see any clients at all until they get to their PhD level because they're more research based. There's other programs where first semester you're working with clients. So it really depends on the program. And so that's something that you should be kind of looking at their websites, talking to students, and really making sure that the ratio of coursework, research, and clinical work fits your goals.
Yes, that's really, really important to add on. Another very quick thing I will add is there's variation, and I know you guys do not necessarily need to be thinking about this right away, but there is variation in the programs in terms of what the career goals they have for their students. There are some programs that are dead set on, we are training you to be academics and scientists, clinical work comes second. Some programs are the other way around. And there are some programs that are a mix. Waterloo is a mix. But even beyond that, it's very much supervisor dependent. It's so important to talk to graduate students in programs you're interested in. Get a sense of whether, where the school is on that balance, and also where the lab you're applying to is on that balance. Again, some professors want students to be very focused on research. Some are open. Some have the opposite. It's diverse.
Okay. Thank you so much for those questions or answers. Sorry, I keep on saying questions instead of answers. Our next question asks, would you happen to know the difference between counseling, MA, and clinical psychology, MA?
Do you want to take that one, Serena?
Sure. It doesn't matter. So counseling programs are primarily focused on training you to do therapy, and the range of the types of client problems you're going to be working with is narrower. It's mostly, they call it like everyday challenges, so like subclinical depression or anxiety or life adjustments. And some counseling programs have a research component. Western has a really, really excellent balance between, has a really excellent counseling program that does have a strong research component to it. There's variation. Some schools have less of a focus on that. A clinical psychology program, you are training to be a scientist who practices on top of that. You are research is like, it's front and center in what you're doing, and it's also front and center in how you think about the problems you work with, and also the range of client problems is different. You are not the range is, I would say, wider because you are qualified to diagnose, so you can treat like I guess more severe conditions, for example, on schizophrenia, bipolar, things beyond depression and anxiety. And you can diagnose, you do the assessment, which I mentioned a bit before. You're expected to learn, you are qualified to like teach and do supervision as well. You're trained to supervise other students because clinical psychologists in hospitals, universities take on leadership positions typically. So it's very much a difference in the type of work you do. But I would say that like counseling programs are really, really excellent if you are passionate about therapy and you're sure that that's what you want your career to look like. Clinical psychology PhDs are if you are interested in therapy, but you want there to be other aspects to your career as well.
Mm-hmm. I think a really good point that Serena made, but just to kind of highlight that more, is like what population you want to work with. So typically with counseling psychology, or like if you're doing your master's in counseling psych, you're most likely working with a non-clinical population. So like she said, everyday problems, people might have subclinical issues, or they're adjusting to divorce or job loss, that type of thing. Whereas with clinical psychology, you're typically working with clinical populations. You can work with everyday problems as well, but there's a lot more of the diagnosis, the assessment, and working with individuals that are not dealing with just everyday problems, but have like a range of symptoms and a clinical diagnosis as well. So in addition to, so even if you do know, like I do for sure want to do therapy, you have to consider what population that you want to work with, and what elements of that therapy process that you want to be able to do with the individual.
There
Also,
is some.
Oh, so sorry.
No,
Go
sorry,
ahead.
I'm just adding, like there is some variation in counseling. You can still work with different types of populations. It's that your training is just more focused on slightly below subclinical. Anyway, yeah, that's all. Sorry.
All good. So our next question is, how important are research publications for admissions to graduate school?
I think that probably very much depends on the area. I know for clinical psych, a lot of people don't have any publications when they apply, and it's not expected for you to have publications when you apply. If you have any, that's great. If you can do like a conference proceeding, so you present at a conference or something, that's fantastic too. But there's not an expectation in the clinical area, at least, to have publications. They help you stand out, but it's not expected.
Yeah, I can second that for the programs I applied to in developmental.
I'll third that in mine too. Mine was a research-based specific program, and having publications is definitely an asset if you do have them. But I think what's just as important is having any sort of good diverse research experience on your CV is just as good as having no publications. That's totally fine.
Awesome. Thank you guys for those answers. Oh my gosh, I did it again. Okay, our next question asks, do you guys think you are able to work a job while in the master's or PhD program?
Not in clinical. Don't do that to yourself at all. I know like first year I was doing like 80-hour weeks, like just for school stuff. And I was so burnt out. Like I don't know if the amount, like the workload is different in other areas, but in clinical, please do not try to work. And in fact, many supervisors will make it clear that you are kind of like not allowed to be working if you're in their lab. So if you're struggling financially, like there's opportunities for additional funding. You can take on additional TA shifts. You can apply for external scholarships. Some supervisors have additional funding and they're able to provide additional funding to their students in addition to the school stipend, but working while you're in clinical is not really an option.
I will just add to that. I do know students from clinical at other schools who did have jobs. It was challenging for them, but it can happen. I think our program specifically emphasizes try not to, because there won't be time. Because also our program is much more a bit strict about finishing in 6 to 7 years. A lot of other programs, there's more. It's like you can take 7, 8. But yeah, I think that is. I don't know what it's like in other. I think I know people in IO psychology. It's not uncommon to have jobs on the side.
Yeah, I think in non-clinical areas it's more common because they don't have the additional client workload, and I believe they take less courses overall than we do.
Yeah, I can vouch for that and just say in the research-based programs, it's very common to see people work part-time jobs. I work 2 part-time jobs, but I keep my hours as low as possible because it does get a little bit overwhelming with your coursework. But at the same time, like Janessa said, you're actually not taking a ton of courses. Like most of your day is spent reading and doing research and analysis and whatnot. So you can actually plan your day out quite well around that to work a job if you need to. But at the same time, I think it's generally expected that you try not to work more than 10 hours a week or so, just because the funding that they give you is really meant to pay you as being a student is your full-time job. That's kind of how they treat it. So it's totally understandable, though, to want to get more money, of course, and have a better wage for yourself. And like Janessa said, you can always take on an additional TA. Which pays quite well actually in grad school. And then you can maybe work a few hours a week on something else just to maybe broaden your CV, but try not to make too much of your day focus on a 9-to-5 job or something like that, because you just won't have the time to really put towards your work and getting your degree finished.
Just a really quick.
I agree.
Sorry, no, go ahead.
No, I'm just gonna say I agree with all of the things you've all said.
Just a really quick note about finances is that, like, I mean, I know what I will say this personally. When I was applying to graduate school, I was not thinking about my finances. I was like, I want to go off into this high-flying graduate program and do all these fun things and save the world and make people happy. I was not thinking about practical things like money, but that actually is quite important because remember, you're spending most of your 20s, or if you're an older student, even some of your 30s, or who knows, there's a lot of age variation in graduate school, and those things become very important. So make sure you are doing your research on the funding and the program. Most of the information is available online. Look up the rent in the area you're applying to. Really, really important if you are applying for schools in downtown Toronto. Keep that in mind. Or Vancouver. And it's important to be practical about these things. And if you need to take time to save up before starting graduate school, there's no rush at all. It's very common for people to, it's pretty rare for people to start. Like, I think it depends on, depending on the program, there's nothing uncommon about taking time off before you start. And yeah, finances are a real concern, and it's important to take that seriously.
I just want to jump into what Serena just said too. Yeah, she's totally right that you can take a gap between your degrees and it doesn't really impact negatively on your application. I took a 4-year gap for just that reason. I wanted to kind of make some cash before I made the big move across the country and stuff, just to kind of make the burden a little easier on myself. And taking a gap is totally fine because it helps you figure out like what you're really interested in if you're not 100% sure about jumping into grad school right away. And it's a great way to just earn money and build up your CV so you feel more confident going into your grad school program. So never feel bad if you want to take a break after your undergrad, because also you just worked really hard for 4 to 5 years. So it's totally understandable too.
I want to like double emphasize and underline that for being a clinician. Like, I started graduate school right after my undergrad degree. I didn't take any time off. And it's like, when you are working with adult clients and they're talking about things that you can't relate, of course, like, they're talking about things you can't relate to. It's like, you know, if I had taken a gap year, I probably would have understood my clients' concerns about insurance or things like that a little bit more than I did being, you know, like a early 20 something. So it's actually, I actually feel like in some ways it's an advantage to take some time off because you develop maturity and life experience. That's not to say that your age impacts your ability as a clinician. There is no evidence for that at all. But I just mean that like it has benefits as well to take time off. Yeah.
Awesome. Very, very insightful answers. So we only probably have time for maybe 1 or 2 more questions. We just want to be mindful of everyone's time. This event is supposed to end at 7:30, though I'm happy to leave the panel up if anyone wants to stay later. But don't feel pressure to, of course. This was supposed to end at 7:30, but moving on to our next question. What is the process like going from a BA to an MASC?
Yeah, I guess I can speak on that. I'm not sure if you want to elaborate on, like, if you mean like the workload or maybe
like a general, like, what's it like going from an undergraduate to a graduate program?
Yeah, I would say it's definitely the master's is a lot more work, I think, and it's a lot more independent. So you're expected to work independently, and I guess depending on your previous research experience, you could get a supervisor for an honors thesis or a directed project that does give you that doesn't provide a lot of guidance. And I guess it really depends on the supervisor as well. But I came from a science degree, and my honors supervisors were very helpful and very much so walked me through the process. So coming into a master's, not saying that I don't get much help, but you are expected to know how to allot your time and how to work on things independently. I would say independence is a big thing. What do you think, Janessa?
Oh yeah, I would agree. I would say the independence is definitely the biggest piece. There's a lot of even just like, you'll be told, you know, your thesis is due in August. And it's like up to you to decide like what, I mean, some supervisors will impose deadlines, but like mine does not. It's like totally up to me to decide what my own deadlines are going to be to make sure that I'm done on time. And so there's definitely a lot of like scheduling yourself, working independently, and like making sure that you're holding yourself accountable, because nobody's going to be holding you accountable except for yourself. So I think that's really the biggest change. Also, the way that the courses are structured are very different, where, you know, like in undergrad, it was a lot more of like the teacher teaching you and you're just kind of sitting there and taking notes, whereas the grad school classes are a lot more of like you do hours of readings before you go to class. And then the class is a lot of almost just like a discussion amongst the students of like the readings and what you found interesting and what your thoughts were on them. So the workload kind of shifts more, and the class dynamic is very different. As opposed, instead of the teacher being the expert, and you being the student, it's more of like, okay, we're colleagues, we're going to discuss things, I want to hear your opinion. So I enjoy that style, but I know some people find that style very nerve-wracking.
I'll just add on to that and say I definitely found that aspect really nerve-wracking. Like, I was the student who never spoke up in class. I always sat in the back of the room. And so kind of transitioning into classes where it was very seminar-based and everyone is expected to participate was definitely a big shock for me. But at the same time, you know, the workload gets higher, but it doesn't mean that the content is getting much more difficult. Like, it certainly is in some ways, but at the same time, you know, definitely though that your undergrad degree is preparing you more than enough for going into a graduate degree. Like, I remember I was terrified about taking graduate level statistics because I'd heard so many horror stories about it. But then going into it and kind of sitting in the class and talking to the professor and stuff, I realized that actually I knew more than I thought I did going in. So never feel like it's going to be too huge of a transition. I think the biggest transition for most students is, like everyone else said, is the independence piece, where you're kind of having to self-regulate yourself and make sure you're kind of balancing a bunch of different tasks at one time. But for the class work specifically, you'll definitely be more than prepared going into it.
Yeah, it's good to like these. I agree with everything. And it's good to think about whether you like working with someone who imposes structure versus someone who doesn't. So I mean, the way you ask that is when you interview with someone, just ask about supervisor style, whether they're very hands-on or hands-off. That's really important. Really, really, really important, because that will determine how you spend your day-to-day throughout your entire degree. So.
Awesome. Thank you guys so much for those answers. I think we might stop the recording now. And I know that there were a few more students who had questions.